Lone country girl faces an impossible choice when a dying Cheyenne warrior collapses on her land. Help him and risk everything, or walk away and live with the consequences forever. What she chooses sets off a chain of events no one could have predicted. Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you like the story and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The Wyoming Territory stretched endlessly beneath a sky so vast it seemed to swallow the earth whole. It was late autumn in 1876, and the wind carried the bite of approaching winter across the plains. Sarah Mitchell stood outside her family's modest homestead, her hands wrapped around a wooden bucket as she gazed toward the horizon. At 23 years old, she had known this land her entire life, yet recently it had become a place of fear rather than comfort. Her father had built this homestead with his own hands 15 years ago, carving out a life from the unforgiving wilderness. But 3 weeks passed, he had ridden to the nearest settlement for supplies and never returned. Her mother had died 2 winters before from fever, leaving Sarah alone with her younger brother, Thomas, who was only 12. The responsibility of protecting him and keeping the homestead running had fallen entirely upon her shoulders. Sarah's auburn hair caught the afternoon light as she turned back toward the small cabin. Her dress, though worn and patched in several places, was clean and well-maintained. She had always taken pride in her appearance despite their humble circumstances. Her green eyes, bright and determined, reflected a strength that belied her slender frame. She was considered beautiful by the few neighbors who lived within a day's ride, though she paid little attention to such matters. Survival demanded all her focus. As she walked toward the well, Sarah noticed movement in the distance. Her heart quickened. Raiders had been spotted in the area over the past months, and several homesteads had been attacked. She quickly set down the bucket and hurried inside, where her father's old rifle stood propped against the wall near the door. Thomas looked up from the table where he had been studying his letters. His sandy hair fell across his forehead, and his blue eyes widened with concern when he saw his sister's expression. "What is it, Sarah?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Someone's coming," she replied, keeping her tone steady for his sake. "Stay inside and away from the windows." Sarah positioned herself by the door, rifle in hand, and peered through a gap in the wooden shutters. The figure approaching was alone, moving on foot rather than horseback. As he drew closer, she realized with shock that he was not a white settler or a raider. He was a Cheyenne warrior. Her breath caught in her throat. Relations between the settlers and the Cheyenne had been tense for years, especially after the recent conflicts that had erupted across the territory. She had heard terrible stories from both sides, tales of violence and retribution that made sleep difficult on quiet nights. The warrior was perhaps 26 or 27 years old, tall and powerfully built. Even from a distance, Sarah could see the strength in his movements, the way he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had survived countless dangers. His long black hair hung loose past his shoulders, and he wore traditional buckskin clothing that bore signs of hard travel. But something about his gait seemed off. He was limping, favoring his left side, and as he came closer, Sarah could see dark stains on his clothing that she recognized as blood. He collapsed to his knees about 50 yards from the cabin, his head bowing forward as if the effort of remaining upright had finally become too much. Sarah's hands tightened on the rifle. Every instinct told her to remain hidden, to protect Thomas and herself from any potential threat. But another part of her, the part that her mother had nurtured with stories of compassion and basic human decency, told her that no one deserved to die alone in the dirt, regardless of who they were or where they came from. She stood frozen at the door, her mind racing through possibilities and consequences. If she helped him and he proved dangerous, she would be putting Thomas at risk. If she left him there and he died, she would have to live with that choice forever. If other Cheyenne came looking for him and found him dead on her property, there could be retaliation against the homestead. The warrior lifted his head slightly, and Sarah saw his face clearly for the first time. He was strikingly handsome, with strong, defined features and dark eyes that held an intelligence and depth that surprised her. Even in his weakened state, there was something noble about him, something that spoke of honor and strength of character. His jaw was set with determination despite obvious pain, and Sarah could see him struggling to remain conscious. Their eyes met across the distance, and in that moment, something passed between them. It was not fear or hatred, but rather a mutual recognition of shared humanity. Sarah saw in his gaze not a savage or an enemy, but simply a man who needed help. And perhaps he saw in her face not a settler or an adversary, but someone who might show mercy when it was needed most. She made her decision quickly, before doubt could change her mind. Setting the rifle aside, but keeping it within reach, Sarah opened the door and stepped outside. She moved carefully, her hands visible and empty of weapons, showing that she meant no immediate harm. "Thomas, stay inside," she called over her shoulder, her voice firm. "Do not come out no matter what you hear." "Sarah, no!" her brother protested, but she had already closed the door behind her. The warrior watched her approach, his dark eyes tracking her every movement. Sarah could see now that he had multiple wounds. A deep gash ran along his left arm, and there was an arrow wound in his side that had been partially treated but was still bleeding. His breathing was labored, and she recognized the signs of someone who had lost significant blood and was fighting to maintain consciousness. Sarah stopped about 10 feet away from him, close enough to speak but far enough to retreat if necessary. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she could feel the weight of the moment pressing down upon her. What she did next would set in motion events that neither of them could possibly foresee. "You're hurt badly," she said, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. She did not know if he understood English, but she continued anyway. "You need help." The warrior's eyes narrowed slightly, studying her face as if trying to determine whether this was a trap or a genuine offer of assistance. When he spoke, his voice was deep and resonant, though weakened by pain and exhaustion. "Why would you help me?" he asked in English that was accented but clear. "Your people and mine are enemies." Sarah was surprised that he could speak her language, though she tried not to show it. She took a small step closer, her decision now fully made. "Because you're hurt and alone," she replied simply. "And because it's the right thing to do." The warrior's name was Kohana, which meant swift, and Sarah learned this as she helped him into the small barn behind the cabin. He had initially resisted her assistance, pride warring with practicality, but his weakened state left him little choice. She could feel the heat radiating from his body as she supported his weight, and she knew that infection had already begun to set in. Time was not on their side. Thomas had watched through the window with wide, frightened eyes as his sister brought the Cheyenne warrior onto their property. When Sarah called for him to bring water and clean cloth, he hesitated for a long moment before obeying. His hands shook as he delivered the supplies to the barn, his gaze fixed on Kohana with a mixture of fear and curiosity. "Go back inside and bolt the door," Sarah instructed her brother gently but firmly. "I'll be fine. Trust me." After Thomas retreated to the cabin, Sarah turned her attention to Kohana's wounds. She had learned basic medical care from her mother, who had served as the unofficial healer for their small community before her death. The arrow wound in his side was the most serious. The arrow had been removed but not cleanly, and the wound showed clear signs of infection. "This is going to hurt," Sarah warned as she prepared to clean the injury. "I need to remove the infected tissue before I can properly dress it." Kohana nodded, his jaw clenching as he prepared himself for the pain. When Sarah began her work, he did not cry out, though she could see the muscles in his neck strain with the effort of remaining silent. His stoicism impressed her, even as she felt sympathy for the agony he must be experiencing. As she worked, Kohana watched her face with an intensity that made her acutely aware of his presence. Despite his weakened state, there was something magnetic about him, a quiet strength that seemed to fill the small barn. Sarah found herself wondering about his life, about the battles he had fought, and the experiences that had shaped him into the man before her. "How did this happen?" she asked, partly to distract him from the pain and partly because she genuinely wanted to know. Kohana was silent for a long moment, and Sarah thought perhaps he would not answer. But then he spoke, his voice low and measured. "There was an attack on my village 3 days ago, not by soldiers, but by men who claimed to be settlers defending their land. They came at dawn when many were still sleeping. We fought back, but we were not prepared for such treachery. Many died, including my sister and her husband." His voice caught slightly on those last words, revealing a depth of grief that he otherwise kept carefully controlled. "I was wounded while helping others escape. I have been traveling since then, trying to return to what remains of my people." Sarah's hands stilled for a moment as she absorbed his words. She had heard rumors of such attacks, whispered conversations between settlers at the trading post, but she had not fully believed them. The reality of such violence, spoken by someone who had lived through it, struck her with unexpected force. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, resuming her work with gentle hands. "No one deserves that. No one. And yet it happens," Kohana replied, his dark eyes meeting hers. "Just as attacks happen on homesteads like yours. The cycle of violence continues because both sides see only enemies, never human beings with families and hopes and fears." His words carried a wisdom that surprised Sarah. She had been raised to view the Cheyenne as dangerous savages, fundamentally different from her own people. But Kohana spoke with the same pain and loss that she had felt when her mother died, when her father disappeared. His grief was her grief. His fear was her fear. In that moment, the barriers of culture and conflict seemed insignificant compared to their shared humanity. "You speak English very well," Sarah observed as she began binding his wounds with clean cloth. "Where did you learn?" "My father traded with white settlers when I was young, before the tensions grew too great. He believed that understanding your language and your ways would help our people survive in a changing world. He taught me everything he knew before he was killed 5 years ago, in a skirmish with cavalry soldiers." Kohana's expression hardened slightly at the memory. He was trying to negotiate peace when he died. Sarah secured the bandage around his torso, her fingers working with practiced efficiency. She could feel Kohana watching her, and when she glanced up, their eyes met and held. There was something in his gaze that made her pulse quicken, a recognition that went beyond gratitude for the help she was providing. It was as if he saw her, truly saw her, in a way that no one else ever had. "Why did you really help me?" Kohana asked suddenly. "You could have let me die out there. It would have been safer for you and your brother. No one would have blamed you." Sarah sat back on her heels, considering the question carefully. She wanted to give him an honest answer, one that honored the trust he had shown by accepting her help. "Because I've seen too much death already," she said finally. "My mother died from fever 2 winters ago. My father rode out 3 weeks ago and never came back. I don't know if he's dead or lost or hurt somewhere, but every day I wake up hoping he'll return. And I kept thinking, what if my father is somewhere hurt and alone, and someone has the chance to help him? I would want them to show mercy. I would want them to see him as a person, not as an enemy." She paused, her voice growing softer. "And when I looked at you, I didn't see a warrior or a Cheyenne or anything else. I just saw someone who needed help." Kohana reached out slowly, his hand hovering near hers for a moment before gently touching her fingers. The gesture was tentative, respectful, yet it sent a jolt of electricity through Sarah's entire body. His hand was warm and calloused from years of hard living, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. "You have a brave heart," he said quietly. "Braver than many warriors I have known. To show kindness to an enemy takes more courage than fighting in battle." Sarah felt her cheeks flush at his words and his touch. She should pull away, she knew. This was dangerous on so many levels. But something kept her hand where it was, her fingers slightly intertwined with his. The moment was broken by the sound of horses approaching in the distance. Sarah pulled her hand back quickly and moved to the barn door, peering out carefully. Her heart sank when she saw 3 riders approaching the homestead. Even from a distance, she recognized them as men from the nearest settlement, rough characters who had caused trouble before. "Someone's coming," she said urgently, turning back to Kohana. "You need to hide. If they find you here, they'll kill you, and probably burn down my home for harboring you." Kohana tried to stand but swayed dangerously. The effort of staying conscious was clearly taking its toll. Sarah moved quickly to his side, helping him toward the back of the barn where hay bales were stacked. She arranged them to create a small hiding space, conscious of how little time they had. "Stay quiet no matter what you hear," she instructed, helping him settle into the concealed space. "I'll get rid of them as quickly as I can." As she covered the opening with additional hay, their eyes met once more. Kohana reached out and caught her hand again, squeezing it gently. "Be careful," he said, genuine concern evident in his voice. "Men who ride in groups often have dark intentions." Sarah squeezed back before releasing his hand and hurrying from the barn. She took a moment to compose herself, brushing hay from her dress and tucking stray hair behind her ears. Then she walked toward the front of the cabin, forcing herself to appear calm and unconcerned. The three riders had dismounted by the time she reached them. She recognized the leader immediately. His name was Jacob Brennan, a man in his early 40s with a cruel mouth and eyes that always seemed to be calculating how to benefit from others' misfortunes. He had tried to purchase her father's land before, offering prices far below its value, and had not taken the refusal well. "Miss Mitchell," Brennan said, his voice carrying false friendliness. "We were passing through and thought we'd check on you and your brother. These are dangerous times for a young woman alone." "We're managing fine, Mr. Brennan," Sarah replied, keeping her voice steady. "Thank you for your concern, but as you can see, we're perfectly safe." Brennan's eyes swept over the homestead, lingering on the barn. "Is that so? We've been tracking a wounded Indian in this area. Dangerous savage attacked a group of settlers 2 days north of here. You haven't seen anything unusual, have you?" Sarah's heart raced, but she kept her expression neutral. She thought of Kohana's story about his village being attacked, about his sister and her husband dying. The contrasting narratives made her realize how easily truth could be twisted depending on who told the story. "I haven't seen anyone," she said firmly. "It's just been Thomas and me, same as always." One of Brennan's companions, a younger man with a scar across his cheek, spoke up. "Maybe we should search the property, just to be sure. For your safety, of course." "That won't be necessary," Sarah said, moving to position herself between the men and the barn. "I would know if there was anyone on my property." Brennan studied her face for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Sarah forced herself to meet his gaze without flinching, though her palms were sweating, and her heart felt like it might burst from her chest. Finally, Brennan smiled, though it did not reach his eyes. "Well, if you're certain. But you should know, Miss Mitchell, that harboring an Indian could be considered treason against your own people. The penalty for such an action would be severe." "I'm aware of the laws, Mr. Brennan," Sarah replied coolly. "And I'm telling you there's no one here but my brother and me." Brennan mounted his horse slowly, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. "We'll be keeping an eye on this area. If that savage shows up, you make sure to fire your rifle 3 times. We'll come running. Otherwise—" He let the threat hang in the air, unfinished but clear. Sarah watched as the 3 men rode away, not allowing herself to relax until they had disappeared over the horizon. Only then did she permit her legs to shake, her breath coming in rapid gasps as the fear she had suppressed finally found release. She returned to the barn quickly, pulling away the hay bales to reveal Kohana still hidden in the small space. He was watching her with an expression she could not quite read, something between gratitude and concern, and something else, something that made her pulse race for entirely different reasons than fear. "They're looking for you," Sarah said unnecessarily. "They said you attacked settlers, but that's not true, is it? It was your village that was attacked. Truth is a fragile thing in times of war," Kohana said quietly as Sarah helped him from his hiding place. "Each side believes their own version, and the real story is often lost between them." The next 2 days passed in a strange rhythm that felt suspended from ordinary time. Sarah tended to Kohana's wounds twice daily, watching with relief as the infection began to recede under her careful ministrations. She brought him food from their meager supplies, always making sure Thomas was occupied elsewhere when she visited the barn. Her brother had not asked questions, but she could see the worry in his young eyes, the confusion about why his sister was protecting someone they had been taught to fear. Kohana's strength returned gradually, though he was still too weak to travel the distance necessary to reach what remained of his people. During the long hours when Sarah sat with him, changing bandages and ensuring he ate enough to regain his strength, they talked. At first, their conversations were cautious, circling around safer topics like the weather and the land. But slowly, inevitably, they began to share more of themselves. Sarah told him about her mother's death, about the long, terrible winter when fever had swept through their small community. She spoke of holding her mother's hand during those final hours, of the weight of promises made to care for Thomas and keep the homestead running. She described her father, a good man but a quiet one, who had loved his family fiercely but had struggled to express it in words. The not knowing what had happened to him was perhaps worse than certainty would have been, she confessed. Every day she woke hoping for his return, and every night she went to sleep with that hope unfulfilled. Kohana listened with an intensity that made Sarah feel truly heard, perhaps for the first time in her life. When he spoke of his own losses, his voice carried a depth of emotion that he had kept carefully controlled during their first meeting. He told her about his sister, Chenoa, whose name meant white dove. She had been gentle and kind, beloved by everyone in their village. Her husband had been Kohana's closest friend since childhood, a bond that made the loss even more devastating. "I should have been there," Kohana said on the second evening, his dark eyes reflecting the lamplight in the barn. "I had gone hunting, tracking elk in the mountains. When I returned and saw the smoke, I knew. I ran until my lungs burned, but by the time I arrived, it was over. The village was burning, and those who survived were scattered." His jaw clenched with barely controlled anger and grief. "I found Chenoa and her husband together. They had died trying to protect the children. At least they did not die alone." Sarah reached out instinctively and took his hand, offering what comfort she could through that simple touch. Kohana looked down at their joined hands, then back up at her face, and Sarah saw something shift in his expression. The walls he had maintained, the careful distance between them, began to crumble. "You risk everything by helping me," he said quietly. "Your home, your safety, your brother's future. Why do you continue to do this?" Sarah considered the question carefully. Over the past 2 days, she had asked herself the same thing many times. The rational answer was that she could not turn away someone in need, but there was more to it than simple compassion, and she knew it. There was something about Kohana that drew her, something beyond his striking appearance and noble bearing. When he looked at her, she felt seen in a way she never had before. When he spoke, she heard wisdom and understanding that resonated deep within her soul. "Because it's right," she said finally. "And because—" She paused, gathering courage. "Because I believe we met for a reason. I don't know what that reason is yet, but I feel it." Kohana's hand tightened around hers. "I feel it too," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "From the moment our eyes met, when I was dying in the dirt outside your home, I felt something I have never felt before. The Cheyenne believe in signs, in messages from the spirits. Perhaps you were meant to find me. Perhaps I was meant to find you." Their faces were close now, close enough that Sarah could see the flecks of amber in his dark eyes, could feel the warmth of his breath. Her heart raced, and she knew she should pull away, should maintain the distance that propriety and safety demanded, but she did not want to. For the first time in 2 years of grief and responsibility and loneliness, she wanted something for herself. The moment was shattered by the sound of gunfire in the distance. Sarah jerked back, her hand leaving Kohana's as fear flooded through her. More shots followed, closer now, and then she heard the thunder of multiple horses approaching at speed. "Stay hidden," Sarah commanded, already moving toward the barn door. But Kohana struggled to his feet, his face set with determination despite his obvious weakness. "No," he said firmly. "If danger comes, I will not hide while you face it alone." Sarah wanted to argue, but there was no time. She could hear shouting now, rough male voices that made her blood run cold. She grabbed her father's rifle from where she had kept it in the barn and checked that it was loaded. Kohana found a pitchfork, testing its weight despite his injuries. They emerged from the barn to find chaos unfolding before them. 6 riders had surrounded the cabin, and Thomas was visible through the window, pressed against the wall in terror. Sarah recognized Brennan immediately, along with his 2 companions from before and 3 additional men who looked even rougher than the others. "Miss Mitchell," Brennan called out, his voice carrying false joviality that did nothing to mask the menace beneath. "Come out where we can see you. We know you're harboring that Indian. One of my men spotted smoke from your barn at odd hours. You've been feeding someone, and it sure isn't just you and your brother eating 3 meals a day." Sarah stepped forward, rifle raised, though her hands trembled slightly. "Get off my property, Mr. Brennan. You have no right to be here." Brennan's expression hardened. "We have every right. Like I told you before, harboring an Indian is treason. We're well within our rights as concerned citizens to investigate and take appropriate action." It was then that Kohana stepped out from behind Sarah, moving to stand beside her despite his weakened state. The effect on the riders was immediate. Hands moved to weapons, and Sarah heard the distinct sound of multiple guns being cocked. "There he is!" one of Brennan's men shouted. "The murdering savage!" "I have murdered no one," Kohana said, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. "It was my village that was attacked without provocation, my people who were killed while they slept. I defended those I could and fled with the survivors. That is no crime." "You're a liar," Brennan snarled. "Indians can't be trusted. Everyone knows that. Miss Mitchell, step away from him now, and we might be lenient about your part in this." Sarah raised her rifle higher, aiming directly at Brennan. "I said get off my property. This man has done nothing wrong. He was wounded and needed help, and I gave it to him. That's not treason, that's basic human decency, something you clearly know nothing about." The standoff hung in the balance for a long, terrible moment. Sarah could feel Kohana tense beside her, preparing for violence despite his injuries. She thought of Thomas inside the cabin, terrified and alone, and knew she had to find a way to end this without bloodshed. It was Thomas himself who changed everything. The cabin door burst open, and her young brother ran out, positioning himself between Sarah and the riders. His face was pale but determined, and he held an old pistol that had belonged to their grandfather, one that Sarah had not even known he knew how to load. "Leave my sister alone," Thomas shouted, his voice breaking slightly but fierce nonetheless. "She saved that man because it was the right thing to do, because that's what Ma taught us. And if you want to hurt them, you'll have to go through me first." Sarah's heart nearly stopped. "Thomas, no, get back inside." But her brother stood his ground, the pistol wavering in his young hands but pointed steadily at Brennan. The sight of a 12-year-old boy willing to die defending what was right seemed to give even Brennan pause. One of the other riders, an older man Sarah did not recognize, suddenly spoke up. "Brennan, this ain't right. The boy's got more honor than the lot of us put together. Maybe we should just ride on." "Shut up, Davies," Brennan snapped. But Sarah could see uncertainty creeping into his expression. This had not gone the way he had planned. Instead of an easy target, he had found a woman and a boy willing to die for their principles, and an injured Cheyenne warrior who stood with quiet dignity despite facing certain death. Kohana stepped forward slightly, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of steel. "I will leave. There is no need for blood to be spilled here today. Let this woman and her brother be. They have done nothing but show mercy to someone in need. I will go with you peacefully if you give me your word that no harm will come to them." "No!" Sarah cried out, turning to face him. "I won't let you sacrifice yourself. We'll fight them together if we have to." Kohana met her eyes, and Sarah saw in his gaze a mixture of affection and sorrow that made her chest tighten painfully. "Your life and your brother's life are worth more than mine," he said gently. "I will not allow you to die for me, and I will not allow you to die when you've committed no crime," Sarah replied fiercely. She turned back to Brennan, her rifle never wavering. "You want to take him? You'll have to kill me first, and then you'll have to kill my brother, and then you'll have to explain to everyone in the settlement why you murdered 2 innocent people in cold blood. Is that really what you want?" The tension stretched impossibly tight. Sarah could see Brennan weighing his options, calculating the cost of his actions. The other riders were exchanging uncertain glances, and she sensed that not all of them were comfortable with how the situation had developed. It was Davies who spoke again, his voice firmer this time. "Brennan, I signed on to track a dangerous criminal, not to murder women and children. This ain't what we agreed to. I'm riding out, and I'm taking anyone with me who still has a conscience." 3 of the 6 riders turned their horses, following Davies as he began to ride away. Brennan watched them go, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. He turned back to Sarah, his eyes cold with hatred. "This isn't over, Miss Mitchell. Not by a long shot. You've made yourself an enemy today and you'll regret it." "The only thing I regret is that men like you exist in this world," Sarah replied steadily. "Now get off my land before I shoot you for trespassing." For a moment, she thought Brennan might actually force the confrontation, but then he yanked his horse's reins viciously and rode off, his remaining 2 companions following. Sarah kept her rifle raised until they disappeared from view, not trusting that they would not circle back. Only when they were truly gone did she lower the weapon, her entire body beginning to shake with reaction. Kohana was beside her instantly, his hand on her shoulder offering support and comfort. Thomas ran to her, and she wrapped one arm around him, pulling him close. "You were so brave," she whispered into her brother's hair. "So incredibly brave. But promise me you'll never do something that dangerous again." "I couldn't let them hurt you," Thomas said, his voice muffled against her shoulder. "You're all I have left." Kohana knelt down to be at eye level with Thomas, wincing slightly at the pain the movement caused. "You have the heart of a warrior," he said solemnly. "You protected those you love without thought for your own safety. That is true courage." Thomas looked at Kohana with a mixture of fear and curiosity. "Are you really a warrior, like in the stories?" "I am," Kohana confirmed, "but perhaps not the kind you have heard about in stories. I am a man who fights to protect his people, just as you fought to protect your sister today. We are not so different, you and I." Sarah watched the exchange with a warmth spreading through her chest. Seeing Kohana speak so gently to her brother, seeing Thomas begin to overcome his fear and see the person rather than the stereotype, felt like hope. Perhaps if they could bridge this divide, others could too. That night, Sarah could not sleep. She lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling of the small cabin while Thomas slept peacefully in the corner. Her mind replayed the day's events over and over, each time finding new details to worry about. Brennan would not simply let this go. Men like him never did. He had been humiliated in front of his companions, and worse, he had lost control of the situation. That kind of man would seek revenge, and Sarah knew that she had painted a target on both herself and her brother. But beyond the fear, there was something else keeping her awake. Something that had nothing to do with Brennan or danger or the precarious situation they now found themselves in. It was the way Kohana had looked at her when he offered to sacrifice himself. It was the warmth of his hand on her shoulder after the confrontation. It was the growing certainty that what she felt for him went far beyond simple compassion or even friendship. She had never felt this way about anyone before. There had been a young man from the settlement who had expressed interest in courting her 2 years ago, but Sarah had felt nothing beyond mild appreciation for his attention. With Kohana, everything was different. When he was near, she felt more alive, more herself than she ever had. When he spoke, she hung on every word. When he looked at her, she felt beautiful and seen and understood in ways she had not known were possible. But what future could they possibly have? The chasm between their worlds seemed impossible to bridge. Even if they could overcome the cultural divide, the prejudice and hatred that surrounded them on all sides would make any kind of life together extraordinarily difficult. And yet Sarah found herself wanting it anyway. Wanting him. Wanting a chance to explore these feelings that had bloomed so unexpectedly in her heart. Unable to bear her thoughts any longer, Sarah rose quietly and wrapped a shawl around her shoulders. She slipped out of the cabin into the cool night air. The stars overhead were brilliant, scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. She walked slowly toward the barn, drawn by an impulse she did not fully understand. The barn door was slightly ajar, and lamplight spilled through the gap. Sarah pushed it open carefully and found Kohana awake, sitting on a hay bale and staring at the flame of a small lamp. He looked up when she entered, and something in his expression told her that he had been unable to sleep as well. "Sarah," he said softly, rising to his feet with more ease than he had shown before. His wounds were healing well, she noted with satisfaction. "Is something wrong?" "I couldn't sleep," she admitted, moving closer to him. "Too many thoughts, too many worries." "I share them," Kohana replied. "I have been thinking about what happened today, about the danger I have brought to you and your brother. I should leave at first light. My presence here puts you both at risk, and I cannot allow that to continue." "No," Sarah said immediately, more forcefully than she intended. "You're not strong enough yet to travel the distance you need to go. And besides, leaving now would not change anything. Brennan already knows you were here. Leaving will not make you safer or us safer." Kohana moved closer to her, close enough that she could see the concern in his dark eyes. "Then what do you suggest? We cannot stay in this standoff forever. Eventually, Brennan will return with more men, or he will find another way to cause trouble. I will not allow harm to come to you because of me." Then we leave together, Sarah said, the idea forming even as she spoke the words. All three of us. We take what we can carry, and we go somewhere far from here, somewhere we can start over. Kohana stared at her in astonishment. You would leave your home? Everything you know, for what? For me? For a chance, Sarah said, her voice growing stronger with conviction. For a chance at something more than just surviving day to day, waiting for the next disaster. For a chance to build a life that is not defined by fear and hatred and loss. She paused, gathering her courage for what she needed to say next. And yes, for you. Because in these few days, you have become important to me in ways I do not fully understand yet but cannot deny. Kohana reached out and cupped her face gently with his hand, his touch sending shivers through her entire body. You have become important to me as well, he said quietly. More important than I thought possible in such a short time. When I look at you, I see not just beauty, though you are beautiful beyond words. I see strength and courage and kindness. I see a future I never dared to imagine before. Sarah leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly at the tenderness of it. When she opened them again, Kohana was watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. Among my people, he said softly, when a man wishes to court a woman, he brings gifts to her family, proves his worth as a hunter and a warrior. But I have nothing to offer you except my heart and my promise to protect you and your brother with my life. Is that enough? Tears pricked at Sarah's eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. It is more than enough, she whispered. It is everything. Kohana lowered his head slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. But Sarah did not pull away. Instead, she rose slightly on her toes, meeting him halfway. Their lips touched in a kiss that was gentle and tentative at first, then deepened as weeks of unspoken emotion found expression in that single moment of connection. When they finally parted, both were breathless. Sarah rested her forehead against Kohana's chest, feeling his heart beating as rapidly as her own. His arms came around her, holding her close, and Sarah felt safer than she had in years. We will need a plan, Kohana said after a long moment, his voice rumbling in his chest beneath her ear. Leaving will not be simple. We will need supplies, transportation, and a destination, and we must ensure your brother's safety above all else. Sarah pulled back slightly to look up at him. There is a settlement 3 days' ride to the west, near the mountains. It is smaller than the one here, but I have heard that the people there are more accepting, less hostile to those who are different. We could start there, see if we can build a life. 3 days is a long journey, especially with Thomas, Kohana said thoughtfully, and Brennan may be watching the roads, but if we travel at night and rest during the day, stay off the main trails, we might manage it. They spent the next hour planning in whispered voices, working out details and contingencies. Kohana's knowledge of the land proved invaluable. He knew trails that few white settlers were aware of, places where they could find shelter and water. Sarah contributed her practical knowledge of what supplies they would need, what they could carry, and what they would have to leave behind. It was decided that they would leave in 2 days' time, giving Kohana additional time to regain his strength and Sarah time to gather supplies without arousing suspicion. She would tell Thomas in the morning, give him time to say goodbye to the only home he had ever known. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Sarah knew she should return to the cabin before Thomas woke and found her missing. But leaving Kohana felt impossibly difficult. She lingered in his embrace, memorizing the feel of his arms around her, the steady beat of his heart, the warmth of his body against hers. 2 days, she said softly, and then we start our new life. 2 days, Kohana agreed, pressing a kiss to her forehead. I will count every moment until then. The following day passed in a blur of activity. Sarah told Thomas of their plan, and after his initial shock, her brother showed surprising maturity in accepting the necessity of leaving. He asked thoughtful questions about where they would go and what their life would be like, and Sarah answered as honestly as she could, acknowledging the uncertainty while emphasizing the hope that drove their decision. Thomas had formed his own bond with Kohana over the past days, and Sarah saw how the warrior's patient attention and genuine respect had won over her brother's initial fear. When Thomas asked if Kohana would teach him to track and hunt like a Cheyenne warrior, and Kohana agreed with solemn seriousness, Sarah felt her heart swell with love for both of them. They spent the day sorting through their possessions, deciding what to take and what to leave behind. Sarah packed her mother's wedding ring, the only piece of jewelry her mother had owned, and a small painted portrait of her parents on their wedding day. Everything else was chosen for practical value: clothes, blankets, cooking implements, her father's rifle and ammunition, seeds for planting, and what food supplies they could carry. As evening approached on the second day, they loaded 2 horses that Sarah's father had left behind. One would carry their supplies, the other would carry Thomas when he grew tired. Sarah and Kohana would walk, preserving the horses' strength for when it was needed most. They were preparing for departure when Sarah heard horses approaching once again. Her heart sank, and she immediately feared that Brennan had returned with reinforcements. But when the rider came into view, she gasped in shock and disbelief. It was her father. John Mitchell looked haggard and worn, his clothes dirty and torn, his face sporting a nasty bruise along one side. But he was alive, and he was home. Sarah ran to him as he dismounted, throwing herself into his arms with a cry of relief and joy. "Pa! Oh, Pa! We thought you were dead." She pulled back to look at him, touching his face as if to confirm he was real. "What happened? Where have you been?" Her father's expression was grim. "I was ambushed on my way back from the settlement 3 weeks ago. Group of men led by Jacob Brennan. They wanted our land, Sarah. They beat me and left me for dead in a ravine. Took my horse and supplies. I've been making my way back on foot, survived by hunting and sleeping rough. I came as fast as I could, knowing you and Thomas were alone." Sarah felt ice flood her veins at the mention of Brennan's name. Everything suddenly made terrible sense. The convenient timing of her father's disappearance, Brennan's sudden interest in checking on them, his rage when she had defied him. This had all been part of his plan from the beginning. Thomas had run out of the cabin at the sound of their father's voice, and John Mitchell embraced his son with fierce intensity. But when he looked up and saw Kohana standing near the barn, his expression hardened. "Sarah, get away from that Indian," he said sharply. "Thomas, get inside the cabin now." "Pa, no, you don't understand," Sarah said quickly, positioning herself between her father and Kohana. "He's not dangerous. He saved us from Brennan. He is a good man, and I trust him with my life." Her father's eyes widened in shock and confusion. "What are you talking about? What has been happening here?" Sarah took a deep breath and told her father everything. She explained how she had found Kohana wounded, how she had chosen to help him despite the risk. She described Brennan's return with his men, the confrontation that had nearly turned violent, and how Thomas had stood up to defend them. She told him of their plan to leave, to find a new life in a place where they might have a chance at peace. Throughout her explanation, John Mitchell's expression cycled through shock, anger, fear, and finally, a kind of reluctant understanding. When Sarah finished, he stood silent for a long moment, looking between his daughter, his son, and the Cheyenne warrior who waited patiently for judgment. "You love him," John said finally, and it was not a question. "I can see it in your face, hear it in your voice." Sarah met her father's eyes steadily. "I do. I know it seems impossible. I know it has happened so quickly, but it is real, Pa. It is the most real thing I have ever felt." John Mitchell turned to Kohana, studying him with the shrewd gaze of a man who had survived decades on the frontier. "You are a warrior of the Cheyenne." "I am," Kohana confirmed, standing tall despite his recent injuries. "But I am also a man who has come to love your daughter and to care for your son. I offer no excuses for my people's actions in this conflict, just as I expect none for yours. But I swear to you on everything I hold sacred that I will protect Sarah and Thomas with my life, that I will honor them and care for them as long as I draw breath." The silence stretched long and tense. Sarah held her breath, knowing that her father's next words would shape all their futures. John Mitchell had every reason to refuse, to see only the danger and impossibility of such a union. But he was also a man who had valued honor and truth above all else, who had taught his children to judge people by their character rather than the color of their skin or the circumstances of their birth. "The world is changing," John finally said slowly, Maybe it is time we changed with it. If Brennan is truly behind my attack, then this land is no longer safe for any of us. And if you love this man, Sarah, if he makes you happy and treats you with respect, then who am I to stand in the way?" He paused, then added more firmly, "But I am coming with you. You are my children, and I will not abandon you to face an uncertain future alone." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she embraced her father. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for understanding." Kohana approached slowly and extended his hand to John Mitchell. "I give you my word as a warrior, and as a man that I will be worthy of the trust you place in me. Your daughter has shown me that there is hope for peace between our peoples, if only we have the courage to reach for it." John clasped Kohana's hand firmly. "Take care of her. That's all I ask. Take care of both my children." "With my life," Kohana promised solemnly. They departed that very night, knowing that Brennan might return at any moment and that their window of opportunity was closing. John Mitchell, despite his exhaustion and injuries, insisted on helping, taking charge of the second horse and ensuring they had adequate supplies. His presence brought a sense of security that Sarah had not realized she had been missing so desperately. As they rode away from the homestead under the cover of darkness, Sarah looked back one final time at the cabin that had been her home for her entire life. She felt a pang of sorrow for all they were leaving behind, for the memories contained within those wooden walls. But when she looked forward again and saw Kohana riding beside her, saw Thomas chattering excitedly to their father about their adventure, and felt the promise of a new beginning stretching before them, the sorrow faded into hope. The journey west was challenging but not as dangerous as they had feared. Kohana's knowledge of hidden trails kept them far from the main roads where Brennan might have watchers. They traveled primarily at night, resting during the day in sheltered spots that Kohana identified with the ease of someone who had spent his entire life reading the land. During those long hours of travel and rest, Sarah watched as her father and Kohana gradually built a relationship based on mutual respect. They spoke of hunting techniques, of survival skills, of the land and its seasons. John Mitchell asked questions about Cheyenne culture with genuine interest, and Kohana answered with patience and openness. Thomas absorbed everything like a sponge, asking endless questions of both men, and clearly delighting in having not one but two strong figures to learn from. And in the quiet moments when they could steal away from the others, Sarah and Kohana continued to build their own bond. They spoke of their dreams for the future, of the life they hoped to build together. Kohana described the Cheyenne marriage customs, and Sarah shared stories of her parents' partnership, how they had worked together to build their homestead from nothing. They kissed under the starlight, held each other close during the cold mountain nights, and slowly began to weave their separate lives into a shared story. On the fourth day, they reached the settlement near the mountains. It was smaller than Sarah had remembered from her one previous visit years ago, but it had a welcoming feel that their previous home had lacked. The people who greeted them were curious, but not hostile, and when John Mitchell explained that they were looking to start fresh and purchase land, several residents offered suggestions and assistance. There was some surprise at seeing Sarah with Kohana, but less judgment than Sarah had feared. The settlement had been founded by people seeking to escape the rigid prejudices of more established communities, and that founding philosophy still seemed to hold sway. An older couple, the Harrisons, even mentioned that there was another mixed family in the area, a white woman married to a man of mixed Cheyenne and French heritage, and they seemed to be doing well for themselves. Within a week, John Mitchell had purchased a plot of land on the outskirts of the settlement, near a clear stream and with good soil for farming. It was not large, but it was theirs, and it offered the promise of a new beginning. They began construction on a cabin immediately, with Kohana and John working side by side while Sarah and Thomas prepared the land for spring planting. The work was hard, but there was joy in it. Sarah found herself singing as she worked, something she had not done since before her mother's death. Thomas seemed lighter, less burdened by fear and responsibility, able to be the child he still was. And her father, despite the hardships he had endured, seemed revitalized by the challenge of building something new. 2 months after their arrival, on a warm spring evening with wildflowers blooming across the meadows and the mountains standing sentinel in the distance, Sarah and Kohana were married. It was a simple ceremony that blended traditions from both their cultures. A minister from the settlement spoke the Christian vows, while a Cheyenne elder who lived in the mountains and had become a friend to Kohana blessed their union according to the traditions of his people. Sarah wore her mother's wedding ring and a simple white dress that she had sewn herself. Kohana wore traditional Cheyenne wedding attire that he had painstakingly created over the previous weeks, the intricate beadwork representing his commitment and devotion. John Mitchell walked his daughter to her husband with tears in his eyes, while Thomas stood proudly as a witness, having been given the honor of holding the rings. As Sarah and Kohana exchanged their vows, promising to love and honor each other through all the challenges that lay ahead, Sarah felt a profound sense of rightness settle over her. This was where she was meant to be, with this man, building this life. The journey had been difficult and dangerous, and she knew that challenges still awaited them. Prejudice would not disappear overnight, and the wounds between their peoples would take generations to heal. But standing there with Kohana's hands clasped in hers, seeing the love and commitment shining in his dark eyes, Sarah knew with absolute certainty that they had made the right choice. Love had the power to bridge divides, to heal wounds, to create something beautiful from the ashes of conflict and loss. Their first kiss as husband and wife was witnessed by a small gathering of settlers and the Cheyenne elder, and the applause that followed was genuine and heartfelt. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Sarah and Kohana stood together, looking out over the land that was now their home. "Are you happy?" Kohana asked softly, his arm around her waist. "More than I ever thought possible," Sarah replied, leaning into his embrace. "When you appeared outside my homestead that day, wounded and dying, I never could have imagined it would lead to this, to us, to this beautiful new beginning. The spirits brought us together," Kohana said, pressing a kiss to her temple, "and nothing will tear us apart. This I promise you, my wife, and I promise you the same, my husband," Sarah replied, turning in his arms to face him fully. "Whatever challenges come, we will face them together, always together." As night fell and stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Sarah and Kohana walked hand in hand toward their new home, toward the life they would build together. Behind them, John Mitchell stood with Thomas, watching his daughter begin her new journey with a mixture of pride and peace in his heart. The past could not be changed, but the future stretched before them full of possibility and hope. The country girl who had frozen when faced with an impossible choice, and the Cheyenne warrior who had collapsed at her feet, had found in each other not just love, but a reason to believe that a better world was possible. And in that belief, in that love, they had discovered the courage to reach for it no matter the cost. Their story was just beginning, but it was already a testament to the power of compassion, the strength of love, and the possibility of unity even in a world defined by division. As the door of their cabin closed behind them, shutting out the darkness and embracing the warmth within, Sarah and Kohana knew that they had found what so many search for their entire lives: a place to belong, a person to love, and a future worth fighting for. And so, in a small settlement near the mountains of the Wyoming Territory, two souls from different worlds became one, proving that love knows no boundaries, recognizes no barriers, and endures beyond all obstacles. Their happy ending was also a new beginning, a promise that from courage and compassion, hope and healing could grow, creating ripples that would extend far beyond their own lives and into the future they would build together.